All the world is just a narrow bridge, just a narrow bridge, just a narrow bridge. All the world is just a narrow bridge, just a narrow bridge, just a narrow bridge. And above all is not to fear at all. And above all is not to fear at all. Because sword cannot pierce it, air cannot dry it, cannot be burned in the fire. It cannot be wet, nor can it die. It is the self in us all. I will no longer doubt that I am the infinite Atman. I will no longer fear, because I am one with Brahman. Knowing this to be true, I surrender it all. Knowing this to be true, I surrender it all. Because sword cannot pierce it, air cannot dry it, cannot be burned in the fire. It cannot be wet, nor can it die. It is the self in us all. It is the self in us all. Good morning.
Good morning.
So the topic today is exploring fear and fearlessness. We all know, of course, that fear is a given. It's a fundamental part of life and consciousness. And while it may not feel good, fear is useful and necessary. In spiritual life, the problem of fear lies in whether we have the wisdom to respond well to it. I'd like to, right up front, acknowledge my appreciation for articles in the Tricycle magazine in fall 2017, which I will draw on now and then in this talk. This talk is going to cover the evolution of fear and its various manifestations. Of course, we're not talking about exhaustively. How fear differs from anxiety, the specific mechanisms of fearfulness, how meditation practice helps our understanding of fear and its workings, and some approaches, examples, to dealing with fear via the 4 yogas and visualizations. So first of all, the evolution of fear. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, I don't know how long ago this was, but 19 million Americans suffer from chronic fear-related disorders. Many people think that the fear of death is the most prevalent, but in fact, it is the fear of living, as we shall see. Fear is a given. Under normal circumstances, it is not a problem. It's a healthy thing. In general, it's awareness of danger. Therefore, fear is protective. It is a fundamental part of life and consciousness. But fear is also the root suffering. All beings feel a deep sense of fear, which stems from the fact that we resist the impermanence of our existence. Our minds tell us fearful stories that we take to be true, and then we act on those fears. Again, fear is built in, instinctive, and natural to all embodied beings. It is the price we pay for embodiment. It manifests as the desire for security. Even Shakespeare in Macbeth has the character Hecate say, "Security is mortal's chiefest enemy." It's psychological. When we do things to try to make ourselves secure, to establish our own sense of identity, we inflame negative emotions. Now, related to security is the fear of or the resistance to change. It takes a lot of energy to continuously ward off inevitable changes. That's wasted energy. There's the existential fear of untimely death or of sudden, unforeseen abandonment, of financial ruin, and what the people around us might do. It's a natural response. When someone is going to steal your food or the land on which you grow your food, and during times of war. But the chronic fear of scarcity or shortage is counterproductive. Now, up to this point, I've been just using the word fear, but there are gradations of fear, and we have a lot of different words to indicate that. So, for instance, in a sort of increasing intensity, we have insecurity, fright, apprehension, foreboding, alarm, panic, dismay, horror, terror, phobia. These are all words that we use to describe different intensities of fear. We have to admit that living as a separate being generates specific, innumerable fears, many of them arising from our need for social connection. Okay, so for instance, there's the fear of not having enough or too much, not being good enough, not being acceptable, not being physically attractive or even being too attractive, being different, or being too much the same. There's the fear of inadequacy, failure, rejection. There's the failure of missing out. That one seems to be quite prevalent, and I can't quite understand it, but it's there. A lot of people have it. The fear of losing control, that's a big one. And the fear of being judged. Then, there's also something called the fear of God, which originates from the vengefulness of the Old Testament, which was later reinforced by a period of kings who were absolute rulers, despots, tyrants, or could be. They weren't necessarily, but they could be. For millennia, this was the highest position in the social order. So God was conceived as a kind of emperor before whom even the kings had to bend. Hence came genuflections, pranams, abasements, averting the eyes, other practices that were sometimes enforced socially with punishments, banishment, even exile or death. Though these feudal and monarchic social systems are gone now, much of the mindset remains. Governments can still ruin your life, especially if you oppose them or expose their secrets. Furthermore, modern advertising and propaganda exploits our innermost fears, heightens them, and prepares us to act on them in ways that are not necessarily to our betterment, but rather propel us toward excitation, unthinkingness, and possibly even finally violence. It seems we're living in a time of pervasive fear, fed by mass media, social media, and the disturbing images that they circulate of continuous crises on our ravaged but ultimately triumphant planet. Also, the rise of the religious right as a political force in the US, the Middle East, and India is totally fear-based and politically manipulated in the struggle for power and domination. From this comes a whole pack of behaviors: altercations, tussles, brawls, attacks, and even war. These behaviors can be aggressive, based on a desire to dominate, or defensive. But what if the so-called national defense is based on an erroneous projection? We're going to talk about projection again a little bit later. But I want to make a little aside. Fear and anxiety are not necessarily the same, although they are often connected. Fear is a signal that we're about to face an imminent and knowable threat. It alerts the body and nervous system to danger. Anxiety, or unease by contrast, is a response to a potential future threat or an inner conflict. It is a feeling of dread that something unwanted may be coming, but when and how remain unknowable and beyond one's control. Anxiety arises as the expression of that internal conflict, generally between our felt experience and our self-concept. Some of the things that I mentioned previously as in the list of fears were actually closer to anxieties. When our felt experience clashes with our self-concept, we often respond by suppressing any feelings that contradict our views of how we need to appear. And when we do that, the anxiety only grows. But we all seek an antidote to habituated emotions. The solution is to develop anxiety tolerance, to prevent the swings and remain in the present, which is where everything unfolds. To learn how to observe and to hold our felt experience, which involves the ability to greet and observe our most uncomfortable and inconvenient feelings with unconditional friendliness. This kind of mindfulness means we need to stop suppressing our emotional experience and learn skillful uses of emotions. Now, all emotions, including fear, are multi-tiered. They have a psychological, a physiological, and a behavioral component. But we also realize that emotions come and go and are by their nature ephemeral. Going back to fear from anxiety, fear is always forward-looking. It's based on a past memory. It revives an old event in our mind, causes us to relive that event, and then projects a repeat scenario into the future. So it says, well, that happened once, so it's going to happen again, or it's going to happen every time. And I didn't like it then, and I'm not going to like it now, and I'm just going to continuously worry that it's going to happen again. That's unskillful way of dealing with fears. To change the cycle from reinforcing our fears to understanding them better, it's necessary to gradually come into contact with your fear. The voluntary exposure to what upsets us will create a new form of reasoning, which consists of creating new, safe memories about your fears. In time, the brain learns those situations don't always need to alert you to escape, to survive. Slowly, your automatic thoughts become different. Feelings and behaviors become calmer. This type of incremental reprogramming is called cognitive behavioral therapy. But way before cognitive behavioral therapy was meditation. Meditation is potentially life-changing. It helps us to stop identifying with strong emotions such as fear and anger so that we can quickly recover our stability and act accordingly. Studies have shown that when meditators are subjected to painful stimuli, this means people who've been doing it for a long time, an experience likely to provoke fear and anger they have the same physiological response as everyone else. But unlike non-meditators who continue to show increasing signs of distress, these meditators return to a baseline of equanimity almost immediately. This is compelling evidence that meditation is no indulgence. It's potentially life-changing and, in the right circumstances, life-saving. When working constructively with fear, or skillfully is another word that is used, the goal is not to negate or suppress or cover over, but to objectively observe and thus ultimately to alleviate our fears and anxiety. Only when emotions are truly attended to can they be endured and transformed into useful energies that express our needs and help guide us through life. When something keeps coming up in meditation, that's the signal that you need to deal with it. You need to process it, not suppress it. Not just, we talk sometimes about obstacles, like, well, it's only an obstacle if you continue to suppress it, because then it will just keep coming up. There's nowhere for it to go. You need to process it thoroughly and fearlessly to feel it, possibly again. It's stored in your memory. Then let it go and come back to the present moment, whatever you're doing in your meditation, practicing your mantra or concentrating on a deity or whatever. So, in a little bit more detail, to do this, notice things as they arrive, things meaning disturbing things. Before they become full-blown and you're caught in their sway, at which point you can't do much about them. In meditation, you slow things down, and that allows you to see the subtle workings, the arising of that disturbance. You catch things when they're manageable. Understanding, examining, knowing, slowing down, these are the first steps in working with fear, the beginning of the path to fearlessness. So, you calmly watch your fears as they arise and subside, as they intrude upon your main task of either, I'm talking about in meditation, your main task of either staying focused on the object of meditation, if that's the type of meditation that you're doing, or keeping the mind completely free from thought, if that's the type of meditation that you're doing. So you have to, as you're trying to stay focused, these things will crop up. Being thus repeatedly exposed to the memories that stir up the fears, gradually, the mind comes to accept the fact that those fears inhabit a very large portion of the mind. It's not an isolated thing. I mean, there might be a main thing, but you'll find that they end up being kind of like linked together. So one thing that you can do after if there's a lot of alarm, that's rather difficult. But once the alarm goes away, so you're saying to yourself, oh, here I am meditating and all I have is this garbage in my brain, but that's normal because the mind is saying, here, deal with it, solve it, resolve it. So after a while, when you get used to the fact that this is inevitable, this is going to happen, you can try saying to an individual memory that comes up, most probably an unpleasant one, oh, there you are. Or, hello, welcome, when the fear arises. And then just look at it calmly. After a while, following this acceptance of the fact that it's there, it exists, it's part of you, then comes making peace with the past and the fears that are embedded in it. The very act of dealing with fear is itself progress toward attaining fearlessness. To do that, we need to develop stability and insight. Stability in itself is not enough. To overcome our fears, we also need insight, which involves profound reflection on our lives. That includes looking deeply at our fear, then looking deeply shows us its nature and teaches us how to work with it. In a sense, it reveals its own workings. And so then you have a clue as to how to back it off. Eventually, we realize that our fears are in no way personal, but all living beings experience fear. So fear is universal. The way to ultimately overcome them at once is to become universal. That is, cease being a separate entity. Fear then becomes merely one of the manifestations of life itself, not separate from bliss or joy or any of the other things positive things that we experience. In Buddhism, fear is not inherent in what is known as basic mind, or what is known as pure consciousness in Hinduism. What is inherent? Clarity, spaciousness, pure awareness. This is the ground of fearlessness. So one of the things that we find out as we go deeper into it is that fear is the food of ego. Ego thrives on fear. So unless we figure out the problem of fear, we're not going to understand or embody any sense of egolessness or selflessness. They're connected very intimately. Both Hindu and Buddhist scriptures assure us that it's possible to be free of suffering and also be alive. That is ultimate fearlessness. To do so, we must undergo a re-educational process. This meditation that I've been talking about is a re-educational process, but it's only part of it because it involves the whole person. There's study, which in Hinduism is called svadhyaya, but it means self-study. It doesn't mean just reading the books. It means study yourself, how you work. The books give you clues. The books give you, information as to how to proceed, but the books themselves aren't going to do anything for you. So there's study, there's concentration, meditation, as we've already talked about, and also changing your lifestyle. You can't make the changes that are necessary if you continue to, go to the bar every night and yuck it up with your friends and get sloshed and go home at 3 a.m. I mean, you can't, you can do that once in a great while, but if that's your lifestyle, I don't think you're going to make a whole lot of progress in dealing with your internal stuff. Okay, so skillful, again, fear is watching it, getting really close to it, and uncovering the purer feelings, ultimately, you'll begin to see, like love that's underneath it. So for instance, you fear for, I don't know how many parents are in here, but you fear for your child. Something bad is going to happen to you. Why? You love the child. Okay? So you find that these things are connected. They're all connected. We can use fear skillfully by redirecting its energy and our attention toward more wholesome virtues like courage and kindness. If one follows this advice, you can reach a stage where you're connected to your own nobleness and the nobleness of others. You realize there is no absolute self, but the self, I'm talking like individual self, is a flexible relational thing. You understand yourself as interwoven with the whole universe. We then begin to develop some appreciation for what is called interdependent arising. That's a Buddhist term, which means the subject and object are both arising together, where in Hinduism we talk about healing the original split that gave rise to our ability to experience. In order to experience, there has to be a subject and something to experience. So this realization of independent arising or healing the subject-object split gives us a feeling of empowerment, of real choice, and a preview to wisdom. Now, sometimes these things only come as inklings, as brief insights, but those brief insights are very powerful, and they work on this deeper aspects of the mind, unknown to yourself, even while you're engaged in doing other kinds of things, and eventually begin to heal. A healing process happens. Now, I want to talk about a few approaches of dealing with fear via visualizations and the 4 yogas, or I should say the 4 yogas first and then visualizations. Now, all of the foregoing, everything that I've talked about so far really falls under the category of Raja Yoga. This is Raja Yoga itself is sort of an elucidation of the psychological housekeeping that occurs in the early stages. Raja Yoga is translated as the kingly science. So it's like the royal road. And it's part of, I'm using it as, I'm kind of saying it's the basis, because you have to be looking at your internal workings in order to make any progress in dealing with fear and becoming fearless. So in my mind, the next yoga that comes into action is karma yoga, because it seems to me to be sort of the opposite side of the coin of meditation. With karma yoga, we put into action what the meditation has revealed to us about ourselves. So this kindness, I've mentioned like kindness and things like that, has to be also, and people talk about forgiveness and whatever. You have to forgive yourself first before you can forgive other people. And that forgiveness is part of the healing process as well, because fear, which we engender because of past experiences, is natural, and we have to forgive ourselves for something that is a natural process and understand it. Swami Vivekananda was always hammering on fearlessness. And he was always hammering on get up and do something too. Face the brute. That's the main thing that he's quoted all the time. He says to people, face the brute, whatever is confronting you. Just do it. Act despite your fear. Take no heed of self-protective consequences. Put into action what meditation has revealed. The karma yogi also reaches the understanding that there is no permanent person, only one self that pervades the entire universe. So the next yoga is Bhakti yoga. It is possible that Swami Vivekananda had in mind the following quote from the evangelist John: "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear," when Vivekananda formulated his triangle of love, which appears in several places in the complete works. And so here's Swamiji's explanation of the triangle of love. We may represent love as a triangle, each of the angles of which corresponds to one of its inseparable characteristics. There can be no triangle without all its three angles, and there can be no true love without its three following characteristics. Excuse me. The first angle of our triangle of love is that love never begs or asks. Love knows no bargaining. Where there is any seeking for something in return, there can be no real love. It becomes a mere matter of shopkeeping. The second angle of the triangle of love is that love knows no fear. Those that love God through fear are the lowest of human beings, quite undeveloped as men. They worship God from fear of punishment. The angle at the base of this triangle is fearlessness. The third angle of the love triangle is that love knows no rival, love for the sake of love itself, the highest abstraction. In it is always embedded the lover's highest ideal. End quote. So you see, you can't truly love without, if there's fear, there has to be fearlessness for real love to manifest. They're connected. Now, when we do our arati hymns in the evening, the English translation, Isherwood's English translation is, Ramakrishna, thou hast finished with fear. But the original is nirbhaya. It's an epithet. The fearless one. He's the fearless one. Fearlessness was a natural trait in Ramakrishna. For example, they have many different examples in his life where he didn't fear people of higher social status. He kind of dealt with everybody on the equal level. He didn't look down on people who were of lower social status. So, for instance, the one that comes to mind is the Rasik, the sweeper in the Dakshineshwar temple. Now, that is about as low as you can get in Indian context at that time. The person who was basically in charge of latrines, okay, taking them, cleaning them, and et cetera, et cetera. And he actually blessed Rasik and blessed him and granted his spiritual wishes, because Rasik had acknowledged Ramakrishna's spiritual stature. He felt, he knew who he was. So anyway, Ramakrishna did not look down on him. He granted him full protection. The other thing was that Ramakrishna, even as a young person, used to go and do his practices in cremation grounds, which are places that people normally avoid. So he had no fears. He was free. If you have no fear, you're free. I mean, seriously. When Swamiji talks about freedom and liberation, I mean, that's it. If you get rid of fear, you pretty much understand what freedom is. Okay, now the last yoga is Jnana Yoga. That is the yoga of spiritual knowledge, which often gets associated with various scriptures and things like that. The one thing that I just want to mention, though, is one of the ancient Upanishads, I believe it is, basically makes a very clear, succinct statement. Where there is two, there is fear. So, for the Jnana Yogi, for the person who follows this path, they understand right from the get-go that there's only life. There is no person who lives a life. I'm going to give you just a few quotes by Sri Nisargadatta on the attainment of fearlessness. In Jnana Yoga, you have to understand that the goal and the practice are the same, as stipulated in the Mahavakya, thou art that. So you're practicing the very thing that you intend to realize. So there are several quotes here. A true jnani has only renounced the idea of a separate universe. You have separated yourself from the world, therefore it pains and frightens you. Discover your mistake and be free of fear. When you happen to desire or fear, it is not the desire or fear that must go, but the person who desires or fears. This person should be carefully examined and its falseness seen, then its power over you will end. You are afraid of reality. Ignorance of yourself makes you afraid and also unaware that you are afraid. That's a very good point. Don't try not to be afraid. Break down the wall of ignorance first. The main point to grasp is that you have projected yourself into a world of your own imagination based on memories, on desires and fears, and that you have imprisoned yourself in it. Break the spell and be free. Once you realize that the world is your own projection, you are free of it. You need not free yourself of a world that does not exist except in your own imagination. See the imaginary as imaginary and be free from fear. Those pithy statements are the crux of the Jnana Yoga path and experience, in my mind. Now, I want to turn to the last bit here, which is a little bit more on the level that most of us operate, but they're very powerful also. I want to look at how images of the divine in various traditions have depicted fearlessness. The message of these images is to be absorbed by the devotee. You may know that when a Hindu goes to a temple to see the deity, the whole thing, the whole transaction happens with seeing, the mutual seeing of the deity and the devotee. There is a connection there, okay? But that connection isn't just in Hinduism. In Russian Orthodox Christianity, the practitioners do the same thing with the icons. Gaze at the icons and get almost like a direct communion with the core or the spirit of that's being depicted in that image. Now, from Catholicism, there are many, many different images of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. But in her aspect as the Immaculate Conception, what's called the Immaculate Conception, she wears this blue cloak, which it kind of symbolizes like sky, expansiveness. And she has open arms, and her hands are open wide and downward, and there are like rays of light coming from her fingers. So she's showering her children with grace, and also you can imagine, it's not a stretch at all to imagine that she's as if to gather up her children. She's opening wide as if to gather up her children. So if you're gazing at that kind of a picture, the protectiveness comes through very, very strongly. And so there's that image. Now I want to switch to the image of Kuan Yin in Mahayana Buddhism. Kuan Yin is the androgynous depiction of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And the name Kuan Yin comes from Quan Shi Yin, which means observing the sounds or cries of the human world. So she's attentive to what is going on. I'm saying she, but it's really kind of androgynous, but it's the most feminine of the Buddhas. So she's attentive to what's going on, and one of her mudras is the Abhaya mudra, that is giving someone protection from fear. The Abhaya mudra kind of is just a gesture of fearlessness and granting protection. So the right hand is raised up and the fingers all together. And if you recall, as I was looking at this, I was like, oh, remember the old cowboy movies? How? It's universal. It's found all over the world. The natives in this land used to use that also for, okay, we've met, like for the first time. There's nothing to fear here. I have no weapon. Okay? So that's called the Abhaya mudra. It's a gesture of fearlessness and granting protection. Now, the last, another, I should say, thing I'm going to mention is also from Buddhism, but it's part of another whole series I want to talk about here. There's an ancient and very clever way to calm down, induce fearlessness, and instill courage. It's a practice that's related to martial arts, where the goal is to achieve a state where there is no more a person who acts, but only the movement. This practice is found all over the world, and it involves putting on armor of protection. So in Buddhism, there's the armor of loving kindness. Develop loving kindness as a direct antidote to fear, and also to instill no fear in others from you. I have nothing to fear from them, they have nothing to fear from me. The main technique of meditation, this is called metta, involves reciting positive phrases toward yourself and those beings. Like other types of meditation, the practice is beneficial for mental, emotional, and physical health. It's especially useful for reducing negative emotions toward yourself and other people. So that's one example from Buddhist practices. But we also have it in Hinduism. And one of them that comes, the main one that comes to mind is called the putting on the armor of Kali. Now, you know that Kali is a very powerful deity, female deity. And when one wears her armor, one feels extremely protected. So there's a whole, shall we say, like prayer or whatever for putting on the armor of Kali, which I'm not going to go into because I'm going to do a different one here. In Christianity, St. Paul refers to putting on the armor of God in his letter to the Ephesians to fight sin and evil inclinations. In Ephesians, Paul's command to put on the new man, or sometimes nowadays even called the armor of light in some Christian circles, is, again, a protective measure. And it frees up the person then to concentrate on advancement in other kinds of ways. If you feel totally, totally protected, then you can concentrate on dealing with your own, your other issues that you may have. Christians now interpret fear of God, which I mentioned earlier, as simply remembering that God is ever with us, watching over us. So you might say that this armor stuff is all magical kinds of practices, but that's not necessarily so. Magic relies on external forces and may be invoked by anyone who does not understand where the real power resides. This armoring comes deliberately from one's own inner resources. You see, the creative power of spirit is intent. When you combine intention with prayer, you can create a new reality in a most powerful way because of the divine assistance from the Supreme Being, who is actually, in our understanding, your innermost self. So there isn't like some mysterious outside force. The last armoring example I want to give here is called St. Patrick's breastplate. Like similar early hymns in Latin, in Old Irish from Ireland, it's a prayer of protection with origins in much older pre-Christian practices. St. Patrick's breastplate can function as divine armor for protection against spiritual adversity. Now, I have adapted the original. You'll see that it couldn't possibly have been this way. And I'm going to substitute different aspects of the divine to show how universal and versatile this technique is. So here's St. Patrick's breastplate. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, Krishna's eye to look before me, Krishna's ear to hear me, Krishna's word to speak for me, Allah's hand to guard me, Allah's shield to protect me, Allah's host to save me, from snares of all evils, from temptation of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill, afar and near. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ to shield me today against all manner of physical harm, so that there may come to me an abundance of spiritual reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me. Mother beneath me, Mother above me, Mother on my right, Mother on my left. Shiva when I lie down, Shiva when I sit down, Shiva when I arise. Ramakrishna in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Ramakrishna in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Ramakrishna in every eye that sees me, Ramakrishna in every ear that hears me, Ramakrishna everywhere. Are there some announcements?
Next week, Swami Mahayogananda will be speaking, and his topic is Vivekananda's Way of Love. Otherwise, classes are going on. Ramnan will be this April. In April will not be the first Saturday, but the second Saturday of the month, because it's Ram Navami at that time. And otherwise, would you like to take questions?
Are there any questions?
Any questions, comments?
No question.
You may choose not to answer it, but you did say we could put on the armor of Kali. I'd be very interested in just a hint if you could do that.
Well, it's not tremendously different than this St. Patrick's breastplate. They are all fundamentally similar. So I don't have it in front of me right now, but I decided it's a little bit more esoteric, but it's fundamentally the same meaning.
Thank you.
I was wondering, sometimes during meditation or when I'm feeling more present or aware, I get a sense of fear and like hopelessness. Just I'm not sure what that could be. Just
Existential fear.
Yeah, and
It's an existential fear. It's a very deep-rooted. It's the most basic.
Yeah, it's hard to explain because I would figure, I'm meditating, I'm doing yoga, so you figure you feel good, but like how do you? So I guess what I'm asking. You feel good. Beginners feel good.
So the further you go, the more stuff comes up.
I guess what I'm asking is what's the best way to deal with this fear?
This lovingness. All beings fear. Bring understanding to it. You have to understand it. You have to like dive into it, and let it reveal itself to you. It will, maybe not immediately, but it will. And then you know how you can tell it's that you're getting somewhere. All of a sudden, you'll get this. Some understanding has arisen, and then when that understanding is there, then you can begin to apply the lovingness and other kinds of things. Like I said here, it's not, you have tapped into the fear that is at the basis of existence itself. It hasn't anything to do with your individual life. It has to do with the fundamental fact of embodiment. So that's very productive, actually, because follow it, and it will reveal many spiritual rewards.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I'm just wondering, actually, if would we be able to get a copy of that speech, of your satsang?
It's going to be online, probably.
On YouTube, Vedanta, or on YouTube, you can find it.
On YouTube, yeah. On our channel on YouTube.
Hi. I want to make sure that I'm clear here that about love. And there's a beautiful AA saying that I really like called progress, not perfection. And that quote in the Bible says, perfect love casteth out all fear. And I remember too Vivekananda way into his relationship with Sri Ramakrishna, testing him still. So are we going to say that he didn't love Sri Ramakrishna? So my concern is, like, isn't love as much an evolution as our losing of fear? Or if you're saying fear is at the base of it all, if we're informed, then underneath the fear, it's the love. And sometimes we tap and sometimes we don't tap?
Absolutely correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, then exactly. The further you, it's like a diving bell, you know? It's like a diving bell, you know? You go down into the fear, that existential fear, not individual because of things that happen, events and whatever, but that existential fear, the further you go down into that, what do you find supporting it? Love. That's why Swamiji talked about this triangle of love.
But to say that we're not loving unless it's that...
Who said that?
The triangle is saying that this is what love is. And just like as humans, we're always evolving in our capacity to express it. It concerns me to not misunderstand that we're not loving if we're not having it be perfect. We fall.
Well, it's incremental. You're on your way.
That's all I wanted to make clear, because it started sounding like this has to be...
No. He said love has 3 inseparable characteristics. It never begs, it knows no fear, and it knows no rival. Love for love's sake.
But how many of us, I mean, this is a lifelong journey.
Correct.
To never beg when you're, again, relationship with love. There is a begging. I mean, isn't that part of what Bhakti Yoga is? Don't we beg the divine? I mean, I do. Okay, I'll be honest.
Well, I mean, there are different levels of understanding, but if you look at as one's understanding grows, then there's less and less of that, because love becomes love for love's sake. Thus, nothing else to be said. Just like all the other yogas, work for work's sake. What was the other? Karma yoga.
It's that self-forgiveness thing, you know, where you say you have to forgive yourself the first before. It's like that danger, I think, of if I'm not loving right. You know, and then you beat yourself up. You want to be careful for that.
Well, yeah, that's not very skillful. We're here to develop, or the whole note of the talk is how to develop skillfulness, and it's an incremental thing. And yes, you can't judge yourself by comparison. Okay, comparing yourself to Ramakrishna or something. I mean, you can't do that. You are who you are. But fundamentally, underneath that, there's no separation between yourself and Ramakrishna. So you can draw on his or whatever. I mean, I had all these other deities in the St. Patrick's breastplate. They are the fountainhead of all qualities, all spiritual qualities, and we just have to learn how to get a straw and suck it up. I mean, seriously, you have to learn how to do that, and so that it fills you up, and you become, even if it's temporary, you know it's temporary because it's a practice. You're learning how to transform yourself from the inside out. See, people always think you're going to transform from the outside in. That doesn't work that way. You have to transform from the inside out.
Namaste. Just a thought. So, as you said, fear is deeply rooted in ego. So, ignorance could be our way to freedom and acknowledge Atman and Brahman at the same time. So, but at the same, there is no two, there's no dualism. So now in the world, with the current situation, you know, there is fear of pandemic, fear of wars. How do you think we can be not in a dualistic world when we are like in this reality, even though we know it is temporal? It's not the real.
Okay, ask that part again.
So how can we manage being in this world, even though we know it's only temporal, it's not forever, it's not our true self, even though we try to understand others as, you know, like part of our consciousness, the collective consciousness sometimes. We try to be together, and at the same time, you feel like you're separate.
Yep, that's the problem. Okay, do this sometimes. Close your eyes and picture Saturn. You know, you understand which planet I'm talking about? So where is Saturn, really? Is it out there, or is it in here? So when we talk about the world, we're usually talking about it as if it's out there, but it's not.
Yeah.
The world is in us. So we have to heal that world that we're experiencing from our inside. Again, it's not an outside applied kind of a thing. This is unfortunately, I think, for all their good intentions, people who work very selflessly a lot of times to help alleviate other people's suffering and stuff, but they think they're working out there.
True.
They're not. Okay, they're working in here, and they're working on themselves as well. So that person or persons that they're assisting exists as much or more inside themselves than outside. So once once we really grasp that everything is issuing from our inside, and I'm sorry to be talking about insides and outsides because, again, that's a duality, but, you know. Then it's kind of like, oh, okay, it's not being imposed. It's part of my own, it's part of my own reality that I carry with me, in me, okay? So if anything is going to be resolved or healed or whatever, it's got to be healed inside first. And then they say, then this loving kindness, if people are following that particular type of meditation or whatever, then other people start to feel it out there because it's sort of like oozing out. It's the same way as, okay, you walk into a room or something and somebody is like really agitated. How do you tell they're really agitated? Well, their foot's moving like this, or they're, you know, looking all around or whatever. What is that? You pick up on that. You know what's going on. Okay, so like that, people pick up on, like in the, when we've had holy men visit us, I mean, like really senior swamis and stuff like that, people walk onto the property, and before they even see him or in his presence, they feel that he's here. They know he's here. They can feel it. Okay, so everybody has, you know, and we're all in it together. Yeah. We're all part of one another's reality. So it's a paradox. I love to talk about paradoxes, but let's not go there right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's one lady over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your message. It just reminds me, I had so many perpetrators in my life. So starting in childhood. And I'm going to say it. I was molested as a child, and I had subsequent perpetrators. So I developed post-traumatic stress disorder and severe depression for decades, Ever since I was a baby, I developed insomnia, So 38 years ago, I was initiated in mantra meditation. And I did that really because I was so depressed, just to help me out of it. There was nothing spiritual in it. Because even at that time, I already believed that, God didn't like me because he made me have a horrible life. So it took decades, really. I used to tell people, and I meditated every single day, twice a day. And there was no results right away. But I used to tell people, I meditate because my body looks for it. I meditate everywhere, at the airport, even in a party, in a park. I just had to do it. And there were no results, really. The results came decades, really. And talking about fear, oh my God, I love this. For me to be able to help myself with my depression, and PTSD, I had to face my fears. I used to call it going to hell and back, because I would journal about it like every morning, and I was so afraid. It was horrible. But I came out of it better. It comes in increments, really, in increments.
That's right. Once we have the intention, and the intention is firmly set, and we begin to take action toward it, meditation being an action also, it begins to work from the inside, and we don't necessarily know that it's working. I remember talking with friends of mine who've been in spiritual life about the same length of time that I have, and it's almost like there's a clock. And we all kind of looked at one another at a certain point and said, something is happening. But you can't be really specific, but you just know it's like something has been transformed. You can't really see it on the outside, but you know that the person that you were, when you started, has really come quite a long way. So congratulations.
And about, up to this day, I still practice. I practice and practice seeing God in everybody. It's not going to be easy because, someone's attacking you. It's kind of hard, but it's just practice. And also, I was such a codependent before. I wanted people to like me. And I'm still practicing on that, not to depend on that. And the third thing, I don't have an armor. What helped me with fear really is to be vulnerable, just like the way I am now, I guess. And it just, my son told me now, he always, this one came out of nowhere. He always tells me that today nothing faces me, So I don't know, from a very fearful person who was very depressed to, I guess,
Very good. That's sort of the opposite of the armor technique.
Yeah.
There is that also, but I didn't mention it because it's really quite deep, and that is to let whatever comes come at you and you absorb that. Because it's going in. Now I'm saying you, not in an individual sense, because at that point you've become universal. It absorbs into the entire universal existence. You see? It's like the person has now kind of like disappeared. And it's like, bring it on, because it goes right through me, that sort of thing. So it can work both ways. Once your mind is set on, I've got to solve these problems, you will find a solution. The problem with most people have is their intent is not firm. And so it wavers all over the place. But if you have a strong intent, you will find a path. So, Jai Ma. Okay. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, Sarve Shantu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukhapag Bhavet. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from ignorance and suffering. May all beings perceive the good. May not anyone undergo suffering. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.